For those who are fans of DEI, yesterday will go down in infamy. It was, you might say, the DEI Pearl Harbor. At 5 p.m., all DEI offices within the federal government closed down. Employees were put on leave as the first step towards mass layoffs. The DEI section of every major federal website went offline. The heads of every DEI office in the federal government were rounded up, chained to giant boulders, and tossed into the sea. That last part didn't happen, unfortunately, but a man can dream. Back in reality, however, the Office of Personnel Management sent out a notice to the head of every federal agency instructing them to ask employees, quote, if they know of any efforts to disguise DEI programs or personnel in the federal government. Employees have 10 days to disclose any disguised DEI programs or personnel that they're aware of. And almost immediately, one of these disguises became pretty apparent. It was visible to anyone who checked out the leadership page of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, or ATF. And specifically, there was an unusual change to the title of one senior official at the ATF. Here's how the Bureau's leadership page looked at the beginning of the week. You can see it there. And as you can see, there's a woman named Lisa T. Boykin, who's listed as the Chief Diversity Officer at the ATF. Now, why does the ATF need a Chief Diversity Officer? What was this person doing every day? Well, who knows? She was collecting a paycheck, at least. We know that. And now that's supposed to change. But the only change the ATF actually made was in the meaningless title they gave this person. So sometime in the last 48 hours, the page changed. And here's what the ATF's leadership page looks like now. Now Lisa Boykin is merely a, quote, senior executive. She's no longer the Chief Diversity Officer. Overnight, she has been graced with a much more generic and inconspicuous title. There was no press release about it. There was no explanation. They just changed it. Check back tomorrow, and the ATF will probably put fake glasses and a mustache on Lisa Boykin and claim her name is really Larry Soykin or something. So these DEI activists aren't completely out of ideas, but very soon they will be completely out of the federal government. At least that's the plan. As recently as a few months ago, a purge like this seemed pretty difficult to imagine, and it was particularly hard for people on the left to imagine. When we filmed Am I Racist?, the DEI activists we spoke to, from Robbie DeAngelo on down, were overconfident to the point of absurdity. And it's one of the reasons we were able to make the film. People always ask how we managed to get the race hustlers and DEI scammers in the room with us. Well, the answer is that we used their own egos and their false sense of security against them. They just couldn't imagine that anyone would ever challenge them or try to embarrass them, because that's the bubble that they were living in. And now it's safe to say that that bubble has been pretty well popped. Now, in fact, their entire industry is crashing down, and not just in the government. The executive orders that Donald Trump has signed are broader than that. One of the orders, for example, is entitled Ending Illegal Discrimination and Restoring Merit-Based Opportunity. And this order explicitly applies to DEI in the private sector as well. Quote, I further order all agencies to enforce our long-standing civil rights laws and to combat illegal private sector DEI preferences, mandates, policies, programs, and activities. Each agency shall identify up to 9 potential civil compliance investigations of publicly traded corporations, large nonprofit corporations or associations, foundations with assets of $500 million or more, state and local bar and medical associations, and institutions of higher education with endowments over $1 billion. In other words, the federal government is gearing up to launch investigations into private sector entities, whether they're universities or hospitals or corporations, that are engaging in discriminatory DEI practices. According to the order, that includes any organization that employs, quote, dangerous, demeaning, and immoral race and sex-based preferences. The order goes on to revoke an executive order signed by President Lyndon Johnson, which required that federal contractors and the federal government take affirmative action to boost certain candidates based on race, color, religion, and national origin. This has been the law of the land for generations. And no Republican president until now has even considered the possibility of ending it. But this time around, the second Trump administration came prepared. It's one of the very first things they got rid of. And the importance of the decision cannot be overstated. I mean, for decades, the requirement that federal contractors practice affirmative action has forced companies to compare their workforce with the demographic composition of the surrounding community. And then they had to alter their hiring practices to try to find more so-called minority candidates, regardless of whether those people were the most qualified. And it's led to an enormous amount of fraud and waste and inefficiency. And that's not even getting into how unethical and immoral and unconstitutional it was. But that's all gone now, or at least it's supposed to be at the federal level. Trump's order forbids the federal government from, quote, allowing or encouraging federal contractors and subcontractors to engage in workforce balancing based on race, color, sex, sexual preference, religion, or national origin. On top of that, all federal agencies have to require every grant recipient to, quote, certify that it does not operate any programs promoting DEI that violate any applicable federal anti-discrimination laws. Within 120 days, the Attorney General will also outline requirements for colleges and universities concerning their own DEI programs. So this is obviously a sweeping order, one that affects hundreds of billions of dollars in government spending. And it's very bad news for universities like Harvard and other bastions of left-wing orthodoxy. It's the kind of order that you'd expect would lead to, a lot of wailing and gnashing of teeth on the left. And certainly that is happening to some extent. But there's also been kind of an interesting wrinkle amid all of this. And it is early. It's still early. This is all just happening. There might be some amount of shell shock on the left as well. I'm sure that's true. But Chris Rufo reported something interesting yesterday. He reported this. Tech executives are telling me that Silicon Valley companies will respect President Trump's ban on discriminatory DEI. Many feel relieved that they don't have to pretend anymore. Resistance here is basically dead. And that was quoting his source within one of these tech companies. So in other words, according to Rufo's reporting, these executives were, experiencing a kind of Stockholm syndrome for the past several years. They knew that DEI was destructive to their business. They wanted it to go away, but they felt they had no choice but to endorse it because on top of the legal requirements, they didn't want to upset left-wing activists and the corporate media. They lacked the spine to stand up for their own business interests. And they felt trapped, so they just went along with it. And this may sound like convenient excuse making, but it may sound like, well, the claim is that these people were victims. That's not the case at all. It's not an excuse, but the scenario here sounds very plausible. After all, tech companies care the most about making money. I mean, you don't become a tech billionaire without understanding how to turn a profit and without prioritizing profits. And DEI is obviously and self-evidently bad for business because it forces you to hire people who are not qualified for the job. It actually makes perfect sense that these companies would be relieved to be done with it. But it's not an excuse. I mean, if anything, it just makes them look worse. DEI proliferated not because all these companies believed in it, but because they were all cowards who didn't have the gumption to speak out, even for the sake of their own economic self-preservation. Like it would be better for them, I think. It'd make them look better if they actually believed in this stuff and now are having some kind of awakening moment. But the truth is, they knew it was nonsense the whole time, and they just did it anyway. Let's talk about something that affects all of us, those of us who are responsible, hardworking Americans, and that is taxes. Now that it's the new year and tax season is upon us, are you prepared for what's coming? Do you owe back taxes? Are your tax returns still unfiled? Missed the deadline to file for an extension. With the new year beginning and heading into the busy tax season, the IRS may be ramping up enforcement. And let me tell you, they're not playing around. You could face wage garnishments, frozen bank accounts, or even property seizures if you haven't taken action yet. But here's the good news. There's still hope. Tax Network USA has been in this game for years, and they know exactly how to navigate the complex world of tax law. They've helped taxpayers save over $1 billion in tax debt and have filed over 10,000 tax returns. That's a billion with a B, folks. They specialize in helping hardworking Americans like you reduce their tax burdens. Look, I get it. Dealing with the IRS is about as fun as a root canal, but ignoring the problem won't make it go away. So here's what you got to do. For a complimentary consultation, call today at 1-800-958-1000 or visit their website at tnusa.com/Walsh. That's 1-800-958-1000 or visit their website at tnusa.com/Walsh today. Don't let the IRS take advantage of you. Get the help you need with Tax Network USA. So it's worth asking whether that response applies to the left more broadly. I mean, one of the most fascinating things about Trump's full-scale assault on gender ideology and DEI in government is the relative lack of left-wing hysteria over it. I mean, certainly there has been plenty of whining and scolding about it, but We haven't seen protests in the street or widespread panic. The outrage, from my vantage point, hasn't quite reached the fever pitch that you would have expected, that I expected. I mean, even the media, from what I can tell, seems to be relatively muted by their standards in their reaction. So here, for example, is a decidedly kind of low energy segment from MSNBC the other day. You'd think they'd be grabbing their pitchforks because of the return of fascism in America, but instead, this is what they came up with. Watch.
Can we just drill down on this DEI initiatives piece for a moment? Because there's research that shows diversity is a strength. It makes organizations stronger, whether federal or private. Sure. So what's the argument behind the scenes for getting rid of the DEI initiatives? Is it just we're getting rid of woke?
Yeah, I think that frankly is the argument. I mean, I think that you know as well as I do that there are a few things that President Trump said in those rallies more than that he would get rid of the woke ideology and he would get rid of DEI practices and instead put back what they call meritocracy type style governments where people are, where basically it's race blind, right? People are promoted by their own merits, they say. And so they believe that this is a fulfillment of those promises that Trump made on the stage.
Okay, so they certainly don't approve of Trump's policies, but you wouldn't call that a hysterical meltdown exactly. The anchor cites that fake McKinsey study about how DEI supposedly improves companies, which we talked about and debunked many times before. Then the reporter says conservatives want to take us back to colorblind, merit-driven society, as if that's a bad thing. But it is, again, a bit low energy. I mean, you contrast that with the hysteria in the days after Trump's first inauguration, there's really no comparison. Back then, everything Trump did was part of a Russian plot to destroy American democracy. Everything was a cause for panic. Everything was a 5-alarm fire. And yet, this has been kind of the response to most of Trump's executive orders, from his order ending DEI at the FAA to his order declaring that indeed there are only two genders and that gender ideology is dead. This is the most far-reaching executive assault on left-wing ideology ever launched by any president ever. And there's not even a close second. We've never seen anything like this, even from Trump in his first term. Truly unprecedented. And yet the left's reaction hasn't matched the moment exactly, especially by, again, their normal standards of hysteria. Why is that? It's worth asking. Now, there are multiple facets to this. The lack of mass protests in the street may be easy enough to explain. It's very cold outside, and we know that left-wing activists are dedicated to their causes as long as that dedication doesn't require them to endure even the slightest bit of physical discomfort. Also, you probably have to pay the protesters more than their usual rate, given the weather conditions, and maybe it's just more than George Soros is willing to shell out. But that's probably part of it, but that's not the whole story. There's also, as we discussed this week, a kind of emotional burnout happening. The left has been screaming hysterically about Trump for 10 years, and it's just not possible to keep up that level of performative outrage indefinitely. Eventually, you lose a bit of steam. And on top of that, the left is in organizational and ideological disarray. They have no clear leader, no clear agenda, no clear political identity. And all of that serves to mute the response to these moves by Trump. But on top of all of those factors, I also have to wonder if at least some on the left are maybe, to some extent, even if subconsciously, sort of relieved to be done with DEI and gender ideology and all the rest. I mean, after all, these things are so absurd on their face that almost no one could have ever really, truly believed in them. I mean, almost no one wants to be in the position of having to defend some cross-dressing man who's crying because he can't disrobe in the women's changing room. Like, that's not a guy that almost anyone actually wants to stand in front of and defend. Almost no one actually thinks it's a good idea to, for example, prioritize diversity in air traffic control hiring. Right? DEI and gender ideology require a suspension of basic common sense that is so extreme that few people could ever achieve it. And everyone else was just pretending. We have suffered through an era in American history that is defined by millions of people pretending to believe the most absurd propositions ever put forward. And now that the cultural tide has changed, the pressure to pretend has been greatly lifted. The true believers in DEI and gender ideology now are looking around and discovering that they are without allies. Trans activists and DEI race hustlers were holding, a lot of people hostage. But the right's political and cultural victories have taken away their ammunition, and it's just hard to keep your hostages in line when they find out that your gun has no bullets. So in other words, for some who ostensibly appear to be on the left on these issues, we are their liberators. That's one theory that may explain one aspect of things. And I believe there's an element of this, at least for some on the left. I certainly think it's the case for business owners and corporate America. But regardless, all that said, one thing we know for sure is that this somewhat eerie lull, it's not going to last. The true believers, and there are plenty of them out there, along with the powers that be on the left, are not going to abandon their agenda. They're not going to surrender to the right and just call it a day and say, never mind, well, forget all of it. They're going to regroup and probably come back eventually with something even crazier than DEI and gender ideology. That's what we can assume if history is our guide, and it should be. And in the meantime, the fact is that pretty much everyone in this country, the vast majority of people, including anyone who flies on a plane, who sends a child to college or applies for a job or a federal contract, is already benefiting from the second Trump administration. Whether they like it or not, they are. This is the swift restoration of sanity that a majority of Americans voted for. Common sense has made a comeback. Team sanity is winning for the moment. But team insanity will be back. And it's up to us to be ready for them. Hey, YouTube, thanks for listening to the show. If you'd like access to my full show with no ads, you should go to dailywire.com and use promo code Walsh to get 2 months free on all annual plans. See you there.